Groaning, welcome to History of Forgotten Souls. The place where voices once silenced breathe again through the passage of time. Before we begin, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? Your city, your country, and what time is it right now where you are? And if you haven't subscribed yet, please do so and like this video, because here we uncover the stories the world tried so hard to bury. Now listen closely, because tonight you'll meet a man whom no one could sell. They first spotted him in the early morning fog of 1847, standing alone near the edge of a dirt road just outside the slave market of New Orleans, a place where human lives were measured, priced, and thrown away without mercy. At first, no one trusted what their eyes were showing them, because the figure in the distance did not resemble a man. He looked like something carved directly from the earth itself, something ancient, something deeply wrong. He stood taller than any man any of them had laid eyes on before, his head rising well above the wooden fence posts, as if the fence had been constructed for children. The trader who noticed him first was a man named Edmund Briggs, someone who had spent 23 years buying and selling human beings, a man who thought he had witnessed everything slavery could possibly create. But when Briggs stopped walking and stared across that dirt road, he felt something unfamiliar crawl through him, something cold, fear itself. The giant did not stir. He did not speak. His arms simply hung at his sides, long and heavy, the muscles clearly visible even from that distance. His shoulders were so impossibly wide they seemed almost unreal. His chest rose slowly with each breath, like the gradual swelling of the tide before a great storm. A group of enslaved men standing nearby noticed Briggs staring, and they followed his gaze. One of them whispered something quietly under his breath. Another stepped backward. No one laughed. No one spoke above a whisper. Because every man present understood one thing without ever saying it aloud. This man was different. Briggs began walking toward him slowly, carefully, his boots sinking into the damp dirt. The closer he came, the more impossible the man became. He was not merely tall, he was absolutely massive. His hands alone were the size of shovels, his fingers thick and heavily scarred. His neck was as wide as another man's thigh, and yet his face remained calm, empty, completely silent. Briggs stopped just a few feet away and looked up. He was forced to look up. He had never before needed to look up at an enslaved man. Not like this. Not ever. The giant's eyes met his own. They were dark, steady, and completely without fear. That was the first thing Briggs noticed. The complete absence of fear. Every enslaved person he had ever encountered carried fear somewhere in their expression, in their eyes, in the tension of their body. But not this particular man. This man stood like a tree that had never once known wind. Briggs cleared his throat. He attempted to speak with authority, but his voice came out thinner than he had intended. "What is your name?" The giant offered no answer. He simply kept staring. Briggs felt irritation rising within him. He was not accustomed to being ignored. He stepped closer. "I asked you for your name." Still absolutely nothing. One of the other traders approached from behind, a shorter man named Calvin Harrove, widely known for his cruel temper. Harrove laughed when he laid eyes on the giant. He walked in a circle around him, inspecting him like livestock. He slapped the giant's arm hard. The sound echoed like wood being struck. "Strong," Harrove said. "Very strong indeed. But strength alone meant nothing if it couldn't be controlled." Harrove grabbed the giant's chin and tried to force his face upward. The giant offered no resistance, but he offered no help either. He simply remained still, unmoving like stone. "Clear's throat," Harrove frowned. Something about that absolute stillness unsettled him deeply. He let go. "Where exactly did he come from?" Harrove asked Briggs. Briggs shook his head slowly. "I have no idea." That was the honest truth. No one knew. The giant had arrived with a shipment from Virginia, but none of the paperwork mentioned him. No record existed, no name, no listed price. It was as if he had materialized from nowhere. And that presented a serious problem, because in the world of slavery, every single human being was supposed to be reduced to mere numbers: age, weight, strength, price. But this man absolutely refused to fit into any numbers. A crowd started to gather. Buyers, traders, curious onlookers. They whispered among themselves. Some laughed nervously. Others simply stared in complete silence. One plantation owner, a heavy man named Thomas Whitaker, stepped forward. Whitaker had built his entire fortune on sugar, and sugar demanded strength. Endless strength. He walked right up to the giant and examined him carefully. He reached out and pressed his hand against the giant's chest, as if testing whether he was actually real. The chest did not move at all. Whitaker smiled slowly. "This one," he announced, "will command a very high price." But even as those words left his mouth, something in his voice betrayed uncertainty. Because deep down inside, Whitaker understood something the others had not yet grasped. Owning a man this massive was not the same as owning other men. This was not merely property. This was something else entirely. Something completely unpredictable. Something that could not be easily transported, easily beaten, easily controlled. The sun climbed higher, burning away the morning fog. The giant remained exactly where he stood, silent, patient, watching, waiting. And though none of them realized it in that moment, this man would soon become the most feared, most discussed, and most impossible slave the market had ever witnessed. Not because he refused to work, not because he fought back, but because no master could move him, and no chain could truly hold him. The first chain they brought was the heaviest one in the yard. A thick iron length usually reserved for men who had already attempted escape and failed. Men whose bodies carried the scars of punishment, and whose spirits had been broken down into obedience. But even the trader carrying it, a narrow-faced man named Silas Monroe, hesitated as he approached the giant, because up close the sheer size of the man distorted the mind. It made normal judgment feel inadequate and unreliable. It made every instinct whisper caution. And yet Monroe had built his entire reputation on control. He had chained hundreds of men. He had broken hundreds more, and he refused to allow doubt to live inside him now. So he stepped forward and wrapped the iron around the giant's left wrist. The metal barely fitting, the cuff pressing tight against skin that felt more like carved wood than actual flesh. And still the giant did not move, did not resist, did not even glance down. He simply stood exactly as he had stood since morning, breathing slowly, watching everything with those silent, steady eyes that revealed nothing and forgave nothing. And Monroe fastened the lock with a loud click, a sound that usually signaled victory. But today it sounded thin and uncertain, like a lie spoken too hastily. And when Monroe stepped back, the chain hung from the giant's wrist like a loose rope tied to a monument. And the crowd leaned in closer, curious, uneasy, waiting to see what would happen next. Because the market had its rules, and one of those rules was simple. Every new slave had to be tested. Everyone had to prove they could be controlled. Had to prove they could be moved. Had to prove they could serve. And so Monroe gestured to two other handlers, men named Jonas Pike and Robert Clean. Both experienced, both confident, both completely unaware they were about to fail in a way no one present would ever forget. And together they took hold of the chain and pulled, not violently at first, but firmly, the way one pulls a stubborn mule, expecting resistance, expecting struggle, expecting the familiar rhythm of dominance and submission. But the giant did not resist. And that was the strangest part of all. He did not pull back. He did not brace himself. He did not tense up. He simply remained. And yet he did not move forward either. And Pike frowned and pulled harder. And Klein joined him with greater effort, their boots digging music into the dirt, their muscles straining, their confidence slipping with each passing second that brought no progress. And the chain grew taut, the iron links groaning softly under the pressure. But the giant remained exactly where he had been standing, unmoved, unshaken, as if the very earth itself held him in place. And a murmur rippled through the crowd, a low wave of disbelief, because this was not how things were supposed to work. Men always moved. They always yielded. They always broke. But this man did neither. And Monroe stepped forward once more, anger rising within him now, embarrassment burning behind his eyes. And he grabbed the chain himself and pulled with all his strength. His jaw clenched tight, his breath sharp, his pride hanging in the balance. And still absolutely nothing happened. The giant's body did not shift even the width of a single finger. And Monroe felt something cold crawl into his chest, something he had not experienced since he was a boy, standing alone in the dark, the feeling of being small. And he released the chain, abruptly stepping back, pretending he had only been testing it, pretending this was completely normal. But everyone watching knew it was not normal. Everyone watching understood they were witnessing something impossible. And into that silence stepped Thomas Whitaker once more. His heavy boots slow and deliberate, his eyes fixed on the giant with a mixture of fascination and calculation. Because Whitaker saw not merely a problem, but an opportunity. He saw strength unlike anything he had ever possessed. Strength that could transform his entire plantation. Strength that could multiply his profits beyond imagination, and he spoke calmly, his voice steady, masking the tension that lurked beneath it. He said, "Bring the wagon forward." And his order was obeyed without question, because Whitaker was wealthy, and wealthy men shaped reality to fit their will, and soon the wagon was brought forward. A reinforced transport cart used for moving the strongest field hands. Its wooden frame thick, its wheels solid, its chains newly forged. And Monroe and the others approached the giant once more cautious now, more aware of the unknown standing before them, and they fastened additional chains around his wrists, his ankles, his waist, each lock snapping shut with forced confidence. And still the giant did nothing, offered nothing. Satisfied, Whitaker gestured toward the wagon and commanded, "Move him." And Monroe hesitated just for a moment before taking hold of the chain and pulling toward the wagon. And the others joined him, pulling harder now, determined to prove control, determined to erase the humiliation of moments before. And for a long second, absolutely nothing happened. And then something did happen. Something subtle, something terrible. The chain did not move forward. Instead, the wagon moved backward, its wheels scraping across the dirt, pulled toward the giant by the force of their own effort, and Pike stumbled, losing his balance. And Clean cursed under his breath, and the crowd gasped openly now, because they understood what they were witnessing. The giant was not resisting. He was not fighting, and yet he was stronger than the combined force of the men pulling the wagon itself. And Whitaker's calm expression cracked just slightly, just enough to reveal the truth he did not want to accept. This was not a normal man. This was not a simple purchase. This was something that could not be measured, could not be predicted, could not be safely owned. And for the first time since building his fortune, Thomas Whitaker felt doubt. And doubt was a dangerous thing for a man whose power depended entirely on certainty. And he stepped closer to the giant, close enough to see the fine details of his face, the small scars along his jaw, the faint lines at the corners of his eyes, the evidence of a life lived long before this moment. A life no document had ever recorded. And Whitaker spoke quietly, almost to himself. He asked, "What exactly are you?" And the giant looked down at him, not with anger, not with submission, but with something far more unsettling, recognition, as if he understood everything, as if he had always understood, as if he had been waiting for this moment long before any of them had even been born. And the silence that followed was heavier than iron, heavier than chains, heavier than the weight of history itself, because in that moment, every man present felt it. The fragile illusion of control, the lie at the very heart of the market, the truth they could never speak aloud. That power built on ownership could crumble in the presence of something that absolutely refused to be owned. And none of them yet understood how far that truth would travel, or how much it would cost them, or how impossible it would become to sell the giant slave, who simply would not move. By midday, the story of the giant had spread far beyond the market and into the streets of New Orleans, carried by whispers that moved faster than wagons, faster than reason, because men who had witnessed his stillness could not stop speaking of it, and men who had not witnessed it could not stop imagining it. And imagination always made things larger, darker, more dangerous, until truth and fear became one and the same. And standing at the very center of that growing storm of rumor was the giant himself. Still bound in iron, still completely silent, still watching, as if time itself had no claim over him whatsoever. And the traders, men who had spent their entire lives reducing human beings to mere objects, now found themselves uncertain how to even describe him, because every word they reached for felt too small, too weak, too dishonest. And Edmund Briggs stood near the wagon, wiping sweat from his neck. Though the heat alone did not explain his discomfort, because deep inside him something older than reason was stirring, something that remembered stories told in childhood about men who were never meant to be owned. And he turned to Silas Munro, and spoke in a lower voice than usual, asking where exactly the giant had come from. And Munro answered with the same uncertainty as before, saying only that the shipment had arrived from Richmond, Virginia, in the late days of 1847, carried on the cargo vessel named the Mercy, a name that now felt like cruel mockery, because Mercy had never lived on that ship. And Munro explained that he had personally overseen the unloading of every enslaved person on board, men, women, and children alike. All of them weakened from the terrible journey. All of them marked by hunger and fear, except for one, except for the giant who had stepped off that ship under his own power, who had not stumbled, who had not looked down, who had not begged for anything. And Munro admitted something he had not told anyone before, something he had kept hidden even from himself, that when the giant's bare feet touched the dock, the other enslaved men had moved away from him, not out of resentment, but out of something closer to reverence, as if they recognized in him something far beyond their shared suffering. And Briggs listened carefully, because traders survived by understanding value, and value was not always visible to the eye. Sometimes value lived in mystery, in fear, in the unknown. And yet mystery also carried enormous risk. And risk could destroy a man faster than poverty ever could. And as Briggs watched the giant now, unmoving despite the iron that bound him, he realized he was looking at a form of risk no ledger could ever calculate. And nearby, Thomas Whitaker stood in complete silence, his mind turning through possibilities, because Whitaker had built his wealth on certainty, on the predictable conversion of human labor into sugar, and sugar into gold. And this man threatened that certainty, not through violence, but through mere existence alone. And Whitaker had witnessed strong men before, men who could lift impossible loads, men who could work from sunrise to darkness without ever collapsing. But strength had always obeyed ownership. Strength had always bent beneath the whip. And yet something in the giant's absolute stillness suggested a completely different kind of strength. A strength that did not require movement to exist at all. A strength that lived in refusal without any resistance. And Whitaker stepped closer once more, studying the giant's face, searching for weakness, searching for fear, searching for any sign whatsoever that this man could be made into property. But he found absolutely none. And instead, he noticed details that unsettled him further. The faint marks across the giant's shoulders. Scars not from whips, but from something older, something far deeper, scars that suggested survival through forces far beyond the plantation system. And Whitaker realized with growing unease that this man's story had not begun with slavery at all. This man had lived before chains, before ships, before markets, and that history, whatever it was, still lived inside him, completely untouched and utterly unbroken. And around them, the market continued its nervous rhythm. Buyers pretending confidence, traders pretending control, everyone pretending that nothing had truly changed. But beneath that performance, the truth waited, heavy and patient, because already attempts had been made to move the giant again, and already those attempts had met with complete failure. And now a new plan was taking shape, a plan born from pure desperation, because Whittaker had decided he would not accept defeat. He would not allow this investment to escape his grasp. And he ordered additional handlers to prepare the reinforced transport frame, a structure of thick oak beams and lead iron designed for the most difficult human cargo imaginable. And as the handlers worked, hammering metal, tightening bolts, avoiding the giant's gaze whenever possible, the giant remained perfectly still, conserving energy, observing everything, waiting. And one handler, a younger man named Elias Carter, could not stop himself from staring because he had never seen a man like this, never felt this strange mixture of fear and curiosity. And Carter found himself wondering something dangerous. Wondering what kind of life could possibly create such a man. What kind of suffering could fail to break him? What kind of will could survive the machinery of slavery completely intact? And Carter quickly pushed the thought away, because thoughts like that could destroy a man's entire place in this world. And when the transport frame was finally ready, Whittaker gave the order to secure the giant within it. And 6 handlers approached together, moving with forced coordination, fastening iron around wrists, ankles, and chest, anchoring each point to the wooden frame, their hands shaking despite their effort to appear calm. And when the final lock clicked closed, they stepped back, breathing heavily, waiting, hoping, and Whittaker nodded toward the wagon team, signaling them to begin, and the horses strained forward, muscles tightening, hooves digging into the dirt, pulling against the weight behind them, and for a brief moment it seemed to work. The frame creaked, the chains tightened. The wagon wheels turned slightly, and hope flickered in Whittaker's chest, fragile and desperate. But then the motion stopped, not gradually, but completely, as if the world itself had decided no further movement would occur, and the horses pulled harder, their bodies trembling with effort, foam forming at their mouths, their eyes wide with confusion and distress. But the frame did not move again, not even slightly, and Whittaker felt something inside him begin to crack. Something deeper than pride, deeper than profit, something closer to belief itself, because he was witnessing a violation of the natural order he depended upon. And the handlers shouted, striking the horses, forcing them to greater and greater effort. But still, the giant did not move, and he did not resist. He did not struggle. He did not fight. He simply existed. And in that existence, he defied every single one of them. And Carter, watching from the side, felt a cold realization settle deep into his bones. The realization that they were not failing to move the giant because of weakness, but because of something else entirely, something no chain could ever address, something no system could ever command. And for the first time since the market had opened that morning, Carter understood the truth. No one wanted to speak aloud. That this man might never be transported anywhere at all. That he might remain exactly where he stood, not through force, but through will alone. And that possibility frightened him more than any act of violence ever could, because violence could be answered, violence could be punished. But this silent, immovable presence offered no target whatsoever, no leverage, no path to control. And as the sun began its slow descent toward evening, casting longer and longer shadows across the yard, those shadows seemed to gather around the giant, merging with him, making him appear even larger, even more permanent. And one by one the men who had tried to move him stepped back, their confidence completely exhausted, their certainty shattered, and the market, which had always been a place of noise and constant motion, fell into a strange and unnatural quiet, because everyone present understood deep down. They were witnessing the beginning of something none of them had ever been prepared to face. The existence of a man who could not be moved, and whose story had only just begun to unfold. Clear as throat, the evening settled over New Orleans like a heavy blanket, the sky turning a bruised purple as the market emptied, except for those still drawn to the impossibility standing before them. Because stories of the giant had already traveled faster than footsteps, faster than the wind itself, whispered through alleyways, across docks, into homes where men and women paused in their daily lives to imagine the sight of him. And the imagination alone made him grow larger, more impossible, more terrifying with each passing moment. And yet he remained silent, unmoving, a monolith of muscle and will that refused to bend to the ordinary rules of men. And as the shadows lengthened across the dirt, those shadows clung to him, merging with his enormous form, and the whispers began once more, this time not merely among traders and buyers, but among the enslaved men and women who had seen him, because they sensed in him something familiar, something that spoke to a deeper, darker knowledge of the world, a knowledge of survival that had nothing to do with chains or whips, or the false authority of men. And one of the older slaves, a woman named Martha Bell, whose hands were worn from decades of labor in cotton fields, murmured to a younger man beside her that he was like the men of the old stories. Men whose strength came not from iron or fear, but from something they carried deep inside them. And the young man shivered, because even in the dim light, he could see that she was absolutely right. There was something about the giant that made the air itself feel different, heavier, charged, as if nature itself recognized his presence and paused to show respect, and far across the yard. Whitaker, still furious but calculating, paced slowly in his heavy boots, the weight of his fortune pressing down on him because he knew that failure to secure this man, to bend him, to move him to his plantation, would not merely cost him money. It would cost him reputation, authority, and pride, things Whitaker valued more than life itself. And he turned to Briggs and Monroe, his voice low but sharp, commanding them to bring forward ideas, strategies, anything at all to convince this man to move. And Briggs spoke first, his tone careful, measured, because he too felt the strange weight in the yard, the invisible pressure of the impossible man before them, and he suggested breaking him down slowly, testing his patience, showing dominance through hours, even days, of controlled force, and Whitaker nodded, though unease flickered in his eyes, because even the idea of forcing him for days seemed insufficient, almost laughable, almost impossible. And so the plan began. A plan born from desperation and human arrogance. To try every method known to traders, to push and pull, to coax and threaten. To appeal to fear, hunger, and pain, knowing that men like the giant usually broke under such circumstances. And yet every test they attempted met with complete failure. Every threat fell flat, every insult, every promise of punishment, every whisper of hope. All of it disappeared against the unyielding presence of the man, and soon the handlers began to speak among themselves, nervously in low tones, questioning whether he was even human in the sense they understood. And one young man, Carter, who had been tasked with watching the giant's feet during the first failed attempt to move him, finally voiced the unthinkable aloud, asking if perhaps the stories were actually true. Stories whispered among enslaved people. Stories of men who were born too large for chains. Men whose strength and will existed in a dimension outside the ordinary world. Men whose bodies carried the memory of ancient powers. Powers no trader could ever calculate or control. And the words hung in the air like smoke, thick and pungent, because no one dared disagree. Yet no one could confirm. And the giant continued to stand completely unmoved, his breath steady, his eyes calm, and the night deepened around him, carrying with it the weight of fear, awe, and uncertainty. Because every man and woman present understood at some level they could not name. That the laws, the chains, the whip, the contracts, all the machinery of human ownership were utterly meaningless here. Completely meaningless in the presence of a man whose body alone refused to obey, whose will alone resisted control, whose very existence unsettled the natural order. And Briggs finally approached Whitaker, speaking quietly but firmly, suggesting that perhaps the man came from the forests of Virginia, from deep riverside plantations far from the eyes of traders, where some enslaved people were known to grow larger, stronger, mysterious men whose size made them difficult to sell, men who carried themselves with the dignity of survival. And Whitaker frowned, though he did not show it openly, because while he had seen tall men, strong men, terrifying men, he had never seen one that moved like a shadow of power, yet remained perfectly still. A man who seemed born to be unbroken, and as he considered the words, he noticed subtle details he had not noticed before. The way the giant's chest rose and fell, slow and measured, almost ceremonial in its rhythm. The scars along his arms that spoke of previous violence, blows that might have shattered an ordinary man, yet left him completely untouched, as if the blows themselves had recognized their own futility. And Whitaker began to wonder against every rational thought he had ever held, whether this man's strength was physical alone, or if something deeper sustained him, some kind of inner force, some kind of history, some kind of knowledge no ledger could ever record. And while Whitaker debated in his mind, the enslaved onlookers continued to murmur, their voices low, curious, fearful, admiring, because they sensed that the giant's power belonged not to Whitaker, or Briggs or Monroe, or any trader. It belonged to him and him alone, a power rooted in survival, endurance, and profound mystery. And as the hours passed, the market itself seemed to bend around him. The usual chaos of shouting, bargaining, and movement gradually slowed. Whispers replaced commands. Hesitant footsteps replaced confident strides, because even the air around him carried weight, a pressure born from impossibility, and one older trader, who had seen more than any other present, whispered to no one in particular that he had never seen a man like this in his 40 years in the trade. That the giant reminded him of the men from old plantations where the woods ran wild, where slaves had sometimes disappeared for months and returned with knowledge, strength, and size no one could explain. And the memory of those stories sent a chill across the yard, because even seasoned traders knew that some men, some human beings, carried secrets no chain could ever break. And Whitaker, listening carefully, realized that he was trapped in a confrontation he had never anticipated. That the market, the rules, the horses, the reinforced wagons, even the strongest men were all utterly useless in this scenario. And yet he could not retreat, because retreat would mean utter humiliation. And humiliation could destroy the carefully built empire of a plantation owner. And so he remained, pacing slowly, calculating possibilities, each one darker than the last, imagining attempts to starve the giant into submission. Imagining the use of the whip. Imagining the splitting of the group to find some leverage. Imagining threats of sale. Imagining every cruel possibility known to man. And none would work. None could work because the giant's existence operated on a completely different plane. Beyond ordinary punishment, beyond ordinary obedience, beyond ordinary fear. And as the sky darkened completely, casting black shadows over the dirt and the wooden fence posts, a realization spread among everyone present, subtle at first, then undeniable, that this man had survived more than chains, more than whips, more than the market itself, and he would survive again. And in that realization grew fascination, terror, and respect, because to exist where no one could control you was to claim a power few had ever witnessed. And Carter, standing slightly apart, could not stop thinking about the stories of the forests and the river plantations. Stories whispered in the dead of night. Stories of men who could not be moved. Men whose labor was valuable, but whose existence defied capture. Men whose presence changed the very energy of a place simply by being there. And the giant standing there, silent, massive, immovable, embodied all of that history and more. Carrying with him the unspoken knowledge of a life beyond calculation, beyond ownership, a life that had begun long before the chains arrived, and would likely continue long after. And the weight of that knowledge settled on the shoulders of every man who tried to touch him, every man who attempted to move him, every man who had counted on reason, on force, on money to dictate reality. And they felt it pressing down, a heaviness they could not shake. And as midnight approached, the lanterns flickering around the yard cast dancing shadows across the giant's body, making him appear taller, darker, more eternal than ever before. And the crowd that had gathered slowly thinned, leaving only the most invested, the most curious, the most desperate, because no one wanted to leave entirely. No one wanted to miss what might happen next. The first time a man had ever truly resisted the machinery of human commerce with nothing but sheer existence. And Whitaker finally stood still, considering what the next day might bring, considering whether the giant could ever be transported at all. Considering whether he was not merely a slave to be sold, but a force of history itself, a living impossibility. And the giant, eyes calm, breath steady, remained at the center of that impossible tension, as though he alone understood the unfolding story of the market, of men, of chains, of fear. And the night deepened around him, thick and patient, and the world seemed to wait for what would happen next. The night gave way slowly to the pale gray light of early morning. The mist hanging over the docks and streets of New Orleans like a shroud, obscuring everything beyond a few feet, and the giant remained at the center of the yard, bound in iron, yet unmoved, silent, yet commanding attention in a way no man could ignore. Because in that silence lay a power older than chains, older than whip, older than the market itself, a power born from survival and endurance, and perhaps something no one living had the right to name. And as the first traders began to arrive for the morning's work, whispers spread among them like wildfire. Stories of the man who could not be sold. Stories of the impossibility standing quietly in the corner. Stories that grew taller with each telling until the giant was no longer merely a man. He was a living legend. A question posed to the universe. A challenge no one dared answer. And Whitaker arrived early. His heavy boots echoing across the dirt. His eyes fixed on the unmoving figure as if searching for cracks, weaknesses, flaws, anything at all that could be exploited. And Briggs and Monroe followed, muttering nervously among themselves, because even they, experienced men of commerce and cruelty, felt the weight of uncertainty pressing down, pressing heavier than any cargo they had ever transported. And the handlers assembled, their faces pale, their hands trembling slightly despite their attempts at confidence, because they knew the first day had been a complete failure. The attempts to move the giant had failed. The chains had failed. The reinforced frame had failed, and now they faced a second day with the same impossibility before them. Yet retreat was impossible. Failure was simply not an option, and Whitaker's pride and fortune demanded action. And so the plan began anew, this time more calculated, more deliberate, more desperate, because they could not allow a single man to defy them. Not when he represented profit, authority, and control. And yet the giant did not act, did not resist, did not acknowledge the schemes unfolding around him. He simply existed. A mountain of muscle and stillness that absorbed every effort, and returned absolutely none. And Briggs spoke first, whispering to Monroe, suggesting they try division, to isolate him from the watchers, to bring him away from the crowd, to remove any energy that might be feeding him. And Whitaker nodded slowly, considering the idea, because if the giant's presence alone strengthened him, then separation might weaken him, and the handlers moved, attempting to lure him toward a smaller space, toward a narrow alley behind the market, toward a temporary pen. Anything to gain some leverage, anything to bend him to ordinary will. And the giant followed with deliberate calm, not resisting, not cooperating, simply moving under his own terms, his pace measured, his gaze steady, and every step he took seemed to reverberate through the earth beneath, as if the soil itself acknowledged the weight he carried. And when they reached the narrow enclosure, the handlers tried once more, fastening chains and locks, tightening iron around wrists, ankles, and waist, pressing every point of contact they could, and still the giant did not yield. Still he did not struggle. Still he remained exactly as he chose to be. And Whitaker, watching from the edge of the pen, felt something he had never felt before, the raw frustration of human impotence, the impossibility of forcing reality to bend to one's will. And he cursed under his breath, muttering that no man should be allowed to survive in defiance of authority. No man should exist outside the rules of commerce. And yet the giant continued to stand, calm, steady, completely unmoved. And as the hours passed, Whitaker and the traders began to notice the subtle signs that this man was more than mere physical strength, that the power he carried was deeper, older, and it resided in the precision of his patience, the certainty of his endurance, the knowledge that he alone determined his actions, and no chain, no whip, no threat, no plan could alter that in any way. And the market grew quiet, because even the most hardened men of commerce could sense the unnatural weight in the air. The unnatural power radiating from one human body. A power that defied all calculation. A power that unsettled every assumption, every plan, every sense of control. And the enslaved men and women present watched with mixed fear, and awe because they recognized something familiar, something their elders had whispered of in secret. Men born outside ordinary bounds. Men whose size and strength were impossible. Men whose presence alone commanded respect. And the stories from Virginia, the distant plantations along the rivers where men had been known to grow larger than ordinary, where they had been rumored to survive storms, attacks, and punishments that would have killed others, suddenly gained profound meaning. Because here he was proof that the old tales were more than mere legend. Proof that human force could exist beyond ordinary measurement. And Briggs whispered to Monroe that if they could not move him, they could at least learn something, they could at least study him, document him, understand what they were facing. And Monroe nodded, though unease lingered, because understanding was useless if power could not be controlled. And Whitaker, not willing to accept hesitation, ordered the construction of a new device, something stronger, heavier, more reinforced than anything they had ever used before. A cage-like frame of iron and oak designed to completely immobilize a man. To hold him in place, no matter the weight of muscle, no matter the force of will. And as the carpenters hammered, as the blacksmiths forged, as the chains rattled, the giant remained silent, calm, and perfectly aware, observing every movement, every glance, every calculation, as if he could see the outcome of every plan before it was even conceived. And when the frame was completed, monstrous in size, capable of containing what should have been impossible, the handlers approached, fastening chains and locks, attaching every restraint with care and precision. And still, despite the weight and ingenuity, despite the combined effort of 6 men pushing and pulling, the giant did not move, did not resist, did not yield in any way. And Whitaker's face darkened because he realized that even his most clever invention, the strongest mechanical device he could imagine, was utterly powerless here. Powerless against patience, against will, against the certainty that resided in the giant alone. And the first whispers began among the traders, tentative at first, questioning whether he was even human, whether he had survived some curse, whether he carried inside him the memory of something older, something the market could not understand, something beyond chains, beyond ownership, beyond profit. And Carter, unable to resist any longer, spoke aloud what others had only dared think. That perhaps this man's strength was not physical alone. That perhaps the secret of survival, the secret of resistance, the secret that made him impossible to transport, resided in something no one could see. Some inner force, some unbreakable resolve, some history that had never been recorded, and the words hung in the air heavier than iron because they dared to suggest that all the rules Whitaker had relied upon were irrelevant, utterly meaningless in the presence of a man whose very existence defied them. And as the sun rose higher, painting the city in pale light, the market became a place of study, observation, and fear, because the giant refused to play by any ordinary rule. And every attempt to understand him only deepened the mystery, revealing subtle details. Scars on his body that suggested previous battles, muscle formations unlike any ordinary man. Eyes that seemed to calculate and remember everything, skin that bore the marks of past survival, hands capable of crushing bone, yet moved with deliberate restraint, and his presence alone created tension. A quiet terror in every observer because they realized that no chain, no whip, no plan, no force could guarantee control. That in this man's existence lay a power that could undo the assumptions of every trader, every owner, every man who thought he could bend others to his will. And Whitaker, pacing slowly, felt the first flicker of fear, a new sensation for a man who had dealt in the suffering of others his entire life. Because the giant was not merely resistance, not merely strength. He was impossibility made flesh, the living embodiment of a truth that no one in the yard wanted to name. That some men could not be owned. That some men existed outside all calculation. And that the market itself, all its rules,